Hi,
Okay.
everybody.
Is it on? Are we on? Are we
We're
live?
on. We are
Oh
we
my
are very
God.
much
We're
live.
because I don't see the recording thing in the corner. I don't know if that's
I do.
you do. Okay. Then
Maybe it's
it's then
because
everything is good. Okay. And you also see us on the online too on YouTube. Are we on
sure
YouTube as
are.
well?
Yep.
Okay. Okay, so we're all live then.
This is actually happening now, Pietro. So
Oh my gosh.
let's
Wonderful. Wonderful.
switch
Fantastic.
into
Yeah, yeah,
show
yeah.
mode.
Switch into show mode. Yeah, absolutely. Well, like I said, I mean, we're going to have you do the introduction. You're the Ed McMahon, as
Thank
it were,
you.
Mark. So I want
Uh,
you to kind of bring us into the show.
well, good afternoon or evening or morning, everyone. My name is Mark Mikoyan. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs for the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research. Thank you for making the time to join us today for this program. And if we said anything during the opening when we didn't know we were live, we hope you'll forgive us if it was inappropriate. Today's webinar is presented as part of the NAASR Kalus Gulbenkian Foundation lecture series on contemporary Armenian issues, which focuses on post-World War II Armenian topics. So we thank the Gulbenkian Foundation for their continuing support of these programs that we do. Likewise, I want to thank the co-sponsor of today's program, the Society for Armenian Studies, and in particular, the SAS President, Barlo Dermogordichian. Both SAS and NAASR are membership-based organizations that depend on membership dues and donations to support our work. These are two very closely related and good collaborating well organizations that are two of the leading forces in promoting and advancing Armenian studies. And I urge you to learn more about both and to become members of these organizations, to support them, and to learn about our work to support Armenian studies. For the sake of brevity, I want to mention just two upcoming events that will take place this week in person as well as online. Tomorrow, Monday, November 17th at 6 p.m. Pacific time, 9 p.m. Eastern time, uh, there will be an in-person talk at UCLA, which will also be online by Anna Alexanyan, Women's Daily Life in Exile, 1915 to 1918. This is organized by the UCLA Promise Armenian Institute and is co-sponsored by the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies, NAASR, and the Ararat Eskijian Museum. On Wednesday, November 19th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 4:30 p.m. Pacific, is NAASR's sixth annual Professor Charles B. Garabedian Lecture given by Benjamin Alexander. And the title of his talk is Ararat in America, Armenian American Culture and Politics in the 20th Century. This will take place in person at NAASR's Vartan Gregorian Building, a short distance from here in Belmont, Massachusetts, as well as online on Zoom and on YouTube. And this is presented by NAASR and again, in collaboration with the Society for Armenian Studies. Enough for announcements. Very excited to have with us our speaker today, Dr. Pietro A. Shakarian, who will speak about his recently published book, Anastas Mikoyan, an Armenian reformer in Khrushchev's Kremlin, which was issued this year by Indiana University Press. Pietro is a historian of Russia and the Soviet Union and a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Historical Research at the National Research University Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburg, Russia. He earned and is currently teaching at the American University of Armenia in Yerevan.
Yeah.
He
We
earned
don't
his
want to we
PhD.
don't want to forget that. We don't want to forget that. You know,
We
because yeah.
definitely don't want to forget
Yeah,
that.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
He earned his PhD in history at at the Ohio State University and his master's at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Uh, I've been looking forward to this talk for a long time, Pietro, having heard about it from you, and I think this is a topic long overdue for this kind of exploration, and we're really pleased to have you with us. If you in the audience have questions, please remember use the Zoom Q&A function, and after Dr. Shakarian's presentation, we will entertain as many as possible. Pietro, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Mark, for giving me the platform to speak today. And the background of this talk actually has its origins when I was presenting. I was actually taking part in this kind of Armenological conference sponsored by the Matanadoran in Yerevan. And I was a part of that, conference took place in the Sunni province. And while I was on the bus, Mark was actually there with his lovely wife. And actually, Mark was inspiring me. Maybe you should do a book talk for NAASR. And the roots of that actually go back to the fact that my book, which I have a copy of it right here, that part of my research was due to NAASR. That NAASR actually helped me with my work. So I just want to give a shout out to NAASR. It's a great resource for anybody who's interested in Armenian studies, in particular in the modern age. And yeah, no, and this book in particular that I've devised, it's not, or that I wrote, excuse me, it's not only about the research that I conducted with NAASR. It's also about it's the work. It's 7 years worth of it's the result of 7 years of work in the Russian archives, the Armenian archives, the National Library of Russia, the National Library of Armenia in Yerevan, the Fundamental Scientific Library in Yerevan. So it's a huge achievement of mine to kind of put all this research together and to kind of bring it to audiences really for the first time. And actually, in many ways, I'm updating our knowledge on not only on Anastas Mikoyan, of course, he's the main man of the main focus of the book, but I'm also updating our knowledge of Soviet Armenian history. Because so much of the information we have on Soviet Armenia, in particular in the English language, was rather outdated. We had this book, a wonderful book written in 1962 by Mary Kilborn Matosian, great scholar, great academic. But we since have, learned much more due to the so-called archival revolution of the 1990s and so on and so forth, that there's so much more now that we know that we didn't know, let's say in 1962 when this book was published. So without further ado, Mark, do you think I should begin my PowerPoint now on the book? Okay, that's fantastic. So allow me just to share my screen, if you will permit me for a moment. Hold on. 1, 2, 3, and here we go. And let me just slip over and hide myself, first of all. And hang on. Hold on. Oops. And here we go. All right. And allow me to play. There we are. Okay, so everybody can see it. Everybody can see the Mark. You can see the PowerPoint. Yes.
I see the PowerPoint, but I no longer see you, Pietro. I only see the
Well,
photo.
you don't see me because I hid myself.
Oh, okay. All right.
That's the reason why, because I want to actually just kind of focus on what I'm showing you here related to the book.
Understood.
So this book is called Anastas Mikoyan, an Armenian reformer in Khrushchev's Kremlin, as Mark was saying. And the main focus of the work actually is on this period of the Thaw, which actually, if I go here a few slides ahead, that this was the period of Nikita Khrushchev, and it derived its name. So I have here Ilya Edinburgh. This is a painting by Martiro Sarian of Ilya Edinburgh, this author who wrote this novella called The Thaw, or in Russian, Otepil, or in Armenian, Zinhal. And this name actually began to describe the whole kind of Khrushchev period. So after the death of Stalin in 1953, gradually you had Khrushchev coming to the leadership. Right here he is. Here's Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, and basically this was kind of a opening, a kind of warming of kind of the cultural politics in the USSR. And Mikoyan, as I found out, was really kind of Khrushchev's number two man on domestic reform. Now, a lot of people know about Mikoyan through his role in the Soviet food industry, or through, perhaps we can say, his role in, I don't know, the Cuban Missile Crisis, international affairs. He was known as Mr. K's fix-it man in the United States. He was also known for taking a more moderate position, let's say, on the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, when the Soviet government, led by Khrushchev, decided to go in with tanks to Hungary. So that's kind of, but what is less known is this role he played in domestic reform, specifically on nationality policy and also on de-Stalinization. So my book reveals that with new material that has been kind of unearthed for the first time. So the first chapter, I wanted to explore kind of Mikoyan's role in the Stalinist repressions in 1937. And it ended up becoming really a chapter that really went into kind of this political history of the Stalinist repressions in Armenia to an extent that really even historians in Armenia didn't go before. So what I actually found out was that there was the first phase of the Stalinist repressions when you had the death or the assassination of Agassi Khanjian. Because Agassi Khanjian was kind of a rival to Lavrenti Beria. Beria wanted him out of the way. And as we know from the archival evidence now, that Beria shot Khanjian, right? Now, I can tell you more about the details of that, but I don't want to, kind of waste my precious time here in my PowerPoint. So I'm just going to say that there was that. And basically afterwards, when Khanjian was out of the way, so to speak, Beria installed his cronies in Armenia, Amatuni, and Khachik Mokdusi, and they kind of unearthed, or they kind of unleashed a total repression against Armenia's top intellectual cultural figures of the day, like Charents, Bakuns, Totevents, these kind of figures. So anyway, then you had the death of Sahakter Gabrielian. That Beria's cronies almost went too far. They killed Sahakter Gabrielian. He jumped out of the third floor window of the NKVD building in Yerevan. That's the national security building of Armenia. And Stalin intervened in 1937. He was very outraged that the Soviet Armenian leadership attempted to hide this fact from him, that they killed Ter Gabrielian. So he sent Comrade Malenkov to Yerevan, not Mikoyan yet. And Malenkov came with a whole kind of NKVD brigade and a whole kind of crew descending on Yerevan, kind of like, the character of Voland in Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, right? Descending on Yerevan. And so Malenkov arrived in Yerevan with this whole retinue that included an NKVD brigade of 5 men, also his close cronies like Vladimir Donskoy and his personal assistant Dmitry Sukhanov, and many others. And this is all information, by the way, that's not known at all in Armenia, and certainly it's not known in the West, and even to some extent in Russia, it was not terribly well known. So anyway, Malenkov arrives in Yerevan. Then later on, what happens is, well, actually what he first does is he tries to consult Beria, because again, they're Beria's cronies, but Beria really doesn't care about his cronies and is willing to sacrifice them to prove his loyalty to Stalin. And then about a week later, Stalin sends Mikoyan to Yerevan to test his loyalty, right? And this is what I describe here in the work is kind of the role of Mikoyan in these repressions, but also highlighting the documentary evidence that Mikoyan was not the initiator of these repressions, that he was actually kind of forced into this by Stalin. In fact, he was forced into this by Stalin against his will, and that this was a loyalty test. And really, Mikoyan, although, again, I also want to stress that he has this role in the repressions, his main position in this whole intervention was really to help appoint a new kind of post-Amatuni leadership in Armenia, led by Grigory Arutinov, and so on and so forth. But Mikoyan is kind of scarred by this whole experience, and it leaves him with a sense of guilt that informs his later efforts on de-Stalinization in the 1950s, in the Khrushchev era. And also it kind of alerts him to the fact of how centralized the Soviet state is under Stalin, and that there is a need that there should be more decentralization. And this is another theme that comes up in Mikoyan's later reforms. So in 1954, all these years later, 1 year after the death of Stalin, right? Basically 2 years before, think about this, 2 years before Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalin at the 20th Party Congress in February 1956, Mikoyan really delivers the first truly anti-Stalinist speech in Yerevan in 1954, where he called for the rehabilitation of the great Armenian poet Yegoshch Charents. But before that, also calling for a more liberalized position toward Armenian national writers like Rafi, Patkanyan, saying that they should be republished, right? That the national nihilists in Armenia. So he talks about this idea that the Soviet Communist Party should be against not only national chauvinism, but also national nihilism, the indifference to national sensitivities and national cultures. And so after he calls for Rafi and Pakayan to be republished, after a brief pause, he calls for the rehabilitation of Yegeshit Charents. And the room explodes in applause for about 35 seconds. So I've listened to the audio of this. By the way, it's online. You can find it on YouTube. In the speech that Mikoyan gives in Russian, heavily with a kind of a heavy Armenian intonation. And he calls for Charents to be rehabilitated. And in that applause, loud applause for 35 seconds, you can feel the atmosphere of change is already happening. And it's not just me who feels like that when I listen to the audio. In this period of time, and also here I just want to show you really quick, actually Mikoyan's wording on Charents, according to the original drafts of the speech, was much stronger. So before, like in the actual speech, he actually says that the former Soviet Armenian authorities were incorrect about their attitude toward Charents, that they were nepravilny. And this earlier version, he says that it was inadmissible what they did to Charents, right? But again, it's not only me who was so taken by the audio that in 1954, the Armenian artist Regina Gazaryan was listening on the radio to this, and she heard Mikoyan mention the name Charents. Now, Regina Gazaryan was entrusted by Charents upon his imprisonment to bury his unpublished manuscripts in the ground. When she heard Mikoyan utter the name Charents, and you can see that here in Armenian, Charents in all capital letters, she was inspired to go and resurrect these manuscripts. Now, this is a painting that she did in the late 1990s. I want to say 1996, 1997, where she shows the year of repression being 1937 and the year of release being 1954, not 1956, not the year of the so-called secret speech from Nikita Khrushchev, but 1954, where she's releasing these unpublished manuscripts of Charents from the ground, right? And also what was quite interesting is that Charents was not technically officially rehabilitated until 1955, 1 year later. But already, if you look, for example, in the Armenian archives at the rehabilitation report of another very famous Armenian writer and victim of Stalinism, Axel Bakuns, it says that Mikoyan's speech here, and it's highlighted here with blue markings, that Mikoyan's speech already de facto rehabilitated Charents, which is really quite interesting. And also Mikoyan calls for the I guess you could also say a kind of a rehabilitation of Alexander Myasny, who was a great, Armenian Soviet leader from the Lenin period, from the 1920s, from the new economic policy period, and that he had been kind of like, his role in the history of Soviet Armenia had been kind of like downplayed, and Mikoyan was saying we need to revive his legacy. And when you come to Yerevan, you still see this legacy. He's a huge statue of Myasny as you enter into the city of Yerevan. And even when you're in St. Petersburg, I had lived in St. Petersburg for 3 years. And I also was teaching there and doing research there and writing this book. And if you go to the House Museum of Sergei Kirov, you'll actually see a portrait of Myasny on the walls. So Myasny was a major, major figure in Armenia. And 1 week after Mikoyan gave the speech, he gave the speech March 11th, 1954. On March 18th, 1954, basically the Soviet Armenian government established kind of a rehabilitation commission, kind of a reconsideration commission to investigate the cases of repressed persons in the Soviet Armenian Republic with of letters that were addressed to Mikoyan to help deal with cases of rehabilitation. Now, part of those materials are in Yerevan, part of them are in Moscow, and in Moscow, at the Russian State Archive, or Gosudarственный Archiv, or GARF, you'll find all the materials related to this rehabilitation commission, and Mikoyan was deeply, deeply involved, as you see here, in his signature blue pencil, signing off on each case. And in the other letter, on the other side, he's writing to Anton Kochinian, basically saying that, keep me updated on all these cases. Let me know about the progress of these cases, right? Mikoyan, among many of the, rehabilitations in which Mikoyan was involved with, was most famously Agassi Khanjian. Khanjian's mother, actually, so he was rehabilitated in January 1956. But Agassi Khanjian's mother wrote to Mikoyan in 1954, August 1954. Actually, well, I think perhaps, I mean, it was slightly earlier, but Mikoyan sent the request in August 1954 to the military procurator, to the investigative authorities. And by January 1956, they found actually that Khanjian had been besmirched and that he had been killed by Beria, and he was rehabilitated. So that was just like one of many examples, and I could mention many more, but again, for brevity's sake, I can only go so far on that. Then also we had former political prisoners, as I highlight in the book, like Alexei Snegov or like Olga Shatanovskaya, who was the secretary of Stepan Shamian in the Baku Commune. Mikoyan, as we know, was involved in the Baku Commune. And you had these former political prisoners, Mark, who were advising Mikoyan and Khrushchev on the whole process of de-Stalinization. So that's what's actually quite remarkable about this. The victims of Stalinism themselves are participating in the dismantlement. And here's a picture of Mikoyan with Shatanovskaya. They're participating in the dismantlement of the Stalin personality cult. And Lev Shamyan, the son of Stepan Shamyan, who was the editor of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, or rather, first deputy editor of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, he also played a very big role, basically opening up his apartment to Gulag returnees, who would then reveal all their stories about Gulag life to Mikoyan and Khrushchev. And Snegov actually was the one who actually played a big role in convincing Khrushchev and Mikoyan of the need to denounce Stalin at the 20th Party Congress in 1956. So this is what leads us again to this extremely important moment in world history, not only in Soviet history and Russian history, but in world history, where Nikita Khrushchev denounces Stalin in the so-called secret speech at the 20th Party Congress on February 25th, 1956. So then, anyway, my third chapter focuses on Mikoyan's activities for Armenia. It's extremely detailed as chapters go. And what's remarkable to me about it is that when I went into this research, I was extremely surprised to find out how involved Mikoyan was in the affairs of Soviet Armenia, because I was kind of imbued with this popular perception that Mikoyan did very little for Armenia, that he might have been involved, yes, in rehabilitations, and he gave the speech in Yerevan, and I knew that from the secondary literature and all this. But I never realized how deeply involved he was in advising Soviet Armenian leaders on various projects in the Republic. And we're talking about all over the Republic. We're talking about from Lori, so this is a photo of him in Sanain, right, in his native village, from Lori, from Alaverdi, all the way down to Agarak on the border with Iran, and also Khapan and Goris and various places in Armenia. He was visiting these communities and advising Soviet Armenian leaders on various projects. Most famously, I want to highlight, and this is a picture of him in Khapan, actually, as a matter of fact. And here's actually, look at the receptions that he got. This is also quite amazing. Armenians really don't remember this, but this is in Kirovakan in March 1962, at his most famous visit, actually, in Armenia, which was in 1962, where look at those crowds. Those crowds are extending all the way back to the city limits of Kirovakan, which is today the Vanazor, which is the third largest city of Armenia. And but the biggest project that Mikoyan was involved in advising was on the Arpa-Sivan Canal. So, as we all know, the waters of Lake Sivan during the Stalin period were used by the Soviet government, harnessed really, to facilitate kind of hydroelectric projects and irrigation projects in the Soviet Armenian Republic. And as a consequence of this, the water levels of Lake Sivan, as we all famously know, went down very low. And to the point that when we look at the Sevan Island, it became the Sevan Peninsula as we know it today. And so there was this the Armenian leadership was like in a crisis mode. They were thinking like, what can we do to save the lake? We don't want the lake to disappear. And so they eventually came to the conclusion that we need to direct the water from the Arpa River in the vicinity of Ayazor to Lake Sevan. And this was considered to be an extremely feasible project. It could work, but the problem was, in order to realize it, Armenia could not fund it from the Armenian Republican budget alone. They needed Moscow's assistance, so they needed to consult with Khrushchev. And this was a situation where they had to talk to Mikoyan first because Mikoyan, as I said, was always advising them. And Mikoyan basically said, okay, well, when you propose, and he's talking now to Yakov Zorobian, he's talking to the leaders of the Soviet Armenian government, Yegashe Asatryan, Anton Konchinian, all these leaders. He's saying, well, in order for you to make this project, for this project to get passed, what you need to do is you should just give Khrushchev just the cost of the tunnel alone, the Arpa-Sivan tunnel alone, and not the associated infrastructure. Because if you give him the full cost, he will go through the roof. And you don't want that to happen, right? And Khrushchev was known for, not exactly, I mean, he was known for having a very short fuse, let's just put it that way. And so the idea was that they would do that. And also Mikoyan suggested, in addition, say that about 30% of the budget for this project will be covered by Soviet Armenia. And so what they did was they took Khrushchev, as we see here, on the boat, on the lake, on Lake Sevan, when he visited Armenia in May 1961. And also, by the way, Marshal Bagramian was taking part in this meeting as well. And they persuaded Khrushchev to save the lake. So that's that. There was also the case, I also go in depth in my book about Mikoyan and his position on Nagorno-Karabakh, which actually over time, he became more and more, at first he was kind of like, more like kind of indifferent to the fate of Karabakh, like in the revolutionary years, in the period of the Civil War, when Mikoyan himself was kind of more in a kind of an internationalist mode. But by the period of the Thaw, Mikoyan became much more sensitive to this discrimination that was happening against the Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians, in part because he was being advised by Soviet Armenian officials who had roots in Nagorno-Karabakh, like Yegashe Asatryan, who was from Chatar village in Nagorno-Karabakh. So he would tell Mikoyan that the Azerbaijani leaders are trying to push us out of Karabakh, just like they pushed us out of Nakhichevan. And actually, what's so interesting is that Sergo Mikoyan, in his memoirs, which were unpublished, I mean, they're only published in an Armenian translation, but there's an unpublished Russian edition. He recounted that in the 1960s at the Mikoyan family dacha, they met with an Azerbaijani official, and Mikoyan basically said essentially the same thing to him, that Baku was, in his view, trying to push out the Armenians out of Nagorno-Karabakh, just like in Nakhichevan, right? So that's another interesting element of this. Then chapter 4, I talk about this idea of Druzhba defended. In this chapter, I talk about Mikoyan's, kind of focus on kind of emphasizing kind of the coexistence of how the compatibility of really Armenian nationalism and Soviet socialism, how the Soviet Armenia is the best means for the existence of the Armenian state, for the Armenian statehood. In the drafts I found of his 1954 speech in Yerevan, he openly talks about the Armenian genocide in 1915, but also emphasizes again that for Armenia, Russia is the best means for survival, and that the protective umbrella of the Soviet Union is the best kind of, I guess you could say, vahan for Armenia. So there's that, but also but there's also this interesting element. That's why I say this is Druzhba defended, because Mikoyan also, in this chapter, I emphasize how he's using this, instrumentalizing his experience of the Baku Commune to emphasize the need for peaceful relations between nationalities in the Caucasus. In 1964 in Baku, as I actually show back here, if we go back one slide, he's meeting with rehabilitated old Bolsheviks. But he also goes and meets, with people in Azerbaijan and all this. And again, I want to emphasize this idea of Druzhba Narodov is translated as friendship of peoples. In Armenian, this is Barikamutyun, right? Although, again, the wording kind of got, screwed up a little bit in the PowerPoint. But even we have the metro here in Yerevan, Barikamutyun metro, right? Friendship metro with a Slavic woman, giving bread and salt to an Armenian woman giving her grapes, this idea of the friendship of peoples. But what was most remarkable to me was these discoveries about Mikoyan in Baku in March 1964, with these huge receptions. You never would imagine today, like in today's Baku, an Armenian would get such a huge reception as this, and not only in Baku, but in Sumgait, of all places. Mikoyan was very well received, and it's amazing looking at these speeches how, people really were in those days kind of believing in this idea of the friendship of peoples, that Armenians and Azerbaijanis can get along, and so on and so forth, right? Then in chapter 5, I talk about Mikoyan's role in rehabilitating and returning the peoples of the North Caucasus, who were deported by Beria and Stalin in the 1940s during the Second World War, the nationalities such as the Karachay, the Kalmyks, Chechens, and Ingush, and Balkars. And specifically, I focus a lot on the Chechens and the Ingush. Why? Because Mikoyan was exactly involved as the first secretary of the North Caucasus in the 1920s. Now, again, that also informs his more sensitive position toward nationalities. In the 1920s, he was involved really in effectively creating Chechnya as an autonomous entity in the North Caucasus. And when the deportations came about in 1944, he was against deporting these nationalities to Central Asia. So when the chance arose, right after Stalin's death, Mikoyan became a very, very active supporter of bringing these people back. Even when you look at the transcripts of the meeting of the Central Committee in the lead up to the 20th Party Congress, Mikoyan is all for bringing these people back. So you see here again, their homelands were kind of disappeared, and even Georgia, as you can kind of see, got a slice of the territory of the former deported peoples, including the Chechens and the Ingush. But then later on, we see that in the 50s, under Khrushchev, most of these nationalities are returned. They return home. But of course, not all of them, as I highlighted in the book, because we have certain exceptions for the Crimean Tatars and Volga Germans, and I go in that in depth in my work. But the most groundbreaking of all is chapter 6, where really I talk about this potential effort, this kind of really interesting what-if scenario, where Khrushchev and Mikoyan were involved in trying to radically reform the Soviet state. And when I say radically reform, I do not exaggerate at all. I was stunned by what I found in the Russian archives, and even what had been published in what the Russians call zborniki, or kind of like, kind of published kind of compilations of archival materials, where Khrushchev and Mikoyan were actually envisioning creating a real democratic system in the Soviet Union, basically effectively creating almost like, I guess we could say, like turning the Supreme Soviet into something akin to a parliamentary, system. It's really remarkable what they were trying to do. Now, a lot of this was based on the idea of Otto Kosinin, who was a kind of Finnish, party leader, party theorist, who was basically saying effectively that we should move beyond this idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat and instead focus on the idea of the all-people state. The idea that we should now focus on building a state for everybody, that the state should serve the people, and that this was consistent with what Khrushchev would say to going toward the position of Lenin, that every cook should control her own state. This is a direct quote from Khrushchev, by the way. And this is, by the way, a photograph from a very famous Soviet film of Devchata from this period of time, from the Khrushchev era. But again, the idea that people should participate in running the state, and really Khrushchev had a kind of a motive, certainty. His main motive behind this was to kind of upset the power of the bureaucracy, which was obstructing all his reforms in the 50s and the 60s. And he felt that if we give the power to the people, and the people are the ones holding the bureaucrats accountable, then they'll be able to update the system themselves, and I won't have to really do anything in terms of shuffling people around, whatnot. Now, Mikoyan, I just want to emphasize, early on in this kind of reform efforts, when they were talking about the program of the Communist Party in 1961, the third party program, Mikoyan basically put forth a new approach toward nationality, which was to reject this idea of the merger of nations, or slianie of nations, and replace it with splizhenie, the idea of effectively rapprochement of nations, which the idea was live and let live. So instead of the ideology of the Communist Party being about forcing Armenians and Russians and Ukrainians and Georgians to all merge and become like a new Soviet person, to kind of like respect those differences, right? And to kind of let the Armenians practice their own national culture, let's say, without being forced to merge with anybody else, right? And if they want to intermingle with the Russians, they can, and that's fine. But the idea was to kind of pursue a live and let live approach toward the nationality question. This party program, this position of Mikoyan, was accepted by the party. It was adopted at the 22nd Party Congress, which was the major de-Stalinization Congress. This was actually following off the 20th Party Congress. This is the Congress, Mark, where they begin to remove Stalin's statue, as we see here. So this was Stalin in Yerevan. Now we know today's Mother Armenia is there. And this is when Stalin's name, like for instance, the city of Stalingrad becomes Volgograd. and so on and so forth. That really effectively, this is kind of the deeper. It's like a deeper level of de-Stalinization that takes place as a result of this Congress. And even in the Soviet satirical magazine Krokodil, they were even making fun of Stalinists who, yes, publicly they praised the 20th Party Congress and Khrushchev's reforms, but at home they're secretly praising Stalin, right? So that's kind of to give you a slice of the time. This was the high period of de-Stalinization in the Soviet Union. And Khrushchev, again, like I'm saying, then wanted to follow up on this party program with a new constitution that would radically devolve powers to the people of the Soviet Union, but not only. He gave Mikoyan the position of the head of the subcommittee on nationality policy and national state construction. And the idea that Mikoyan envisioned here was to devolve more powers. So the Stalin Constitution of 1936 was very centralized. And the idea was to undo that centralization and give, let's say, Armenia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan more kind of political autonomy vis-a-vis the center. But also they advocated giving more autonomy to autonomous republics, autonomous oblasts. So even there was a proposal to allow autonomous republics and autonomous oblasts, maybe, to potentially, or actually more autonomous republics. Autonomous oblasts were not, this was not yet extended to them, but the proposal was for autonomous republics to change the Union Republic to which they were subordinated. So if you apply that formulation to autonomous oblasts, in the case of Nagorno-Karabakh, we can see what might happen in such a scenario as this. And they also were looking at the example of Yugoslavia. They also were looking, by the way, at the constitutions of West Germany, of the United States. They were looking at the West too. That's what's so remarkable about this. It's not like as if they were completely, in like in a silo or something. They were looking at what else was happening, what other, people were trying in terms of this, kind of reform. So the idea would be to devolve radically more powers to the Union Republics. But and even by the way, they solicited the opinions of the Soviet citizens. They got tons of letters, including some letters that were calling for the unification of Nagorno-Karabakh with Armenia. Even the famous letter to Khrushchev in 1962 of Karabakh Armenian activists. This was even framed, by the way, in the context of the constitutional reform of the 1960s. Right, so I have here the original copy of that letter from the Armenian archives, and there's a handwritten Armenian note that precedes it, where basically they frame this request to join either Soviet Armenia or the Russian SFSR in the context of the constitutional reform. So you have that, but unfortunately the reform was never realized because Khrushchev was overthrown in October 1964, and Brezhnev came to power after that. But still, this sensibility for devolving more powers to republics lingered, and we could see that in films like, and even the short story, by the way, of Hrant Mativosyan with We in Our Mountains, but also the film, certainly Henryk Malian's film. And then, as we know, this was later expressed by Mikhail Gorbachev with the New Union Treaty, and that's pretty much all I have for you today. So thank you very much, Mark, and thank you very much, everybody, for allowing me to give you my spiel on this history. Now, how do I go back and change this? Okay, I think we're okay. Okay, yes. We're back. Okay, we're back. Okay, we're back. All right.
Thank you, Pietro, very much for the review of the book. There is obviously a lot more packed into the book even than Pietro could get through in that time, and certainly urge you to check it out. I posted the link to purchase it from the NAASR bookstore in the chat. You can also find it in other fine booksellers. And if you have questions you would like to post in the Zoom Q&A, please do. I see. Yes, there is one question. Did you collect anecdotal information from people who had actually met with Mikoyan? Did you do oral? Did you do interviews and oral histories, or was this strictly archival and literature research?
It was. I did do oral history a little bit. I did speak with Nikita Khrushchev's son, Sergei Khrushchev. We went to Cranston, Rhode Island, spoke with him. I also interviewed I interviewed the daughter of Lev Shamyan, Tatiana Shamyan, who is a very famous Orientalist in Moscow, but also I consulted memoirs, which were actually quite rich in material. So I mentioned the memoirs of Anton Khrushchev. Well, I don't know if I mentioned them here, but I mentioned in other interviews the memoirs of Anton Khrushchev in Armenian and Yegashe Asatryan also in Armenian. And actually, I did do some kind of like informal kind of oral history work, like in regions. I asked people some questions about Mikoyan or whatever, but it wasn't like really, so deep. It could be much deeper, I think, as a matter of fact. I would see my book as kind of a departure point, really, for a more scientific exploration of what people in the regions felt, because when you see these massive receptions of Mikoyan in places like Kirovakan or in, I don't know, Agarak, and even if you look at the local party papers. So if you go to the National Library of Armenia, you can find in local newspapers from these places, like Aliverdi, like Agarak, or actually Megri. It would be the local news party paper of Megri, but it would be reflecting his visit to Agarak. Or let's say Kajaran, they would be writing special stories that would only be unique to that specific newspaper about his visit there. And they would say that, Mikoyan will never forget Mikoyan's visit to our town in March 1962. And of course, now nobody remembers Mikoyan's visit to that town in 1962. But more interesting to me were the memoirs of the Soviet Armenian officials, especially Asatryan and Khrushchev, because those were written in the Armenian language. They devoted entire chapters to Mikoyan. And what was so astounding to me is that Armenians in Armenia had never engaged with this material. And what was even more astounding to me is how their memoirs corresponded with what I found in the archives in Moscow. And it was just like amazing to me that actually, like, even if you go to Moscow, you find like a whole list of Mikoyan's recommendations to Armenian leaders. Mikoyan was even he was even advising on renaming communities in Armenia. When we talk about this whole issue of toponyms in Soviet Armenia and name changes in Soviet Armenia, there was even cases where Mikoyan was even advising on name changes in Soviet Armenia, and that's documented by archives. But I also was keen to see actually how the memoirs in Armenian corresponded with the archival evidence, and that's also how I would get to know if a memoir was reliable. If a memoir was not corresponding with the archival evidence, if there was some deviation from that, then I knew that this person's memory might be kind of a little bit off or something like that. But memory is a little tricky, actually, because memory, you can't depend on that for all your information. It's even Mikoyan wrote that in his own memoirs. He said that I can't be, that I can't even trust my own memory. When he was writing the foreword to his own memoirs, Mikoyan himself wrote this. But what's incredibly amazing to me is how, again, you have two very prominent Soviet Armenian officials, Khrushchev, who was the first secretary from 66 to 1974, and then Asatryan, who was kind of like one of the top deputies of Zarobyan in the early 60s. And they both devote entire chapters to Mikoyan and his role in Armenia. That was just like stunning to me. That was like stunning to me. And we still had, even as late as like the last few years, people saying, well, Mikoyan, what did he do for Armenia? Nothing, that kind of thing. Yet we had in the Armenian language two memoirs where they had whole chapters devoted to Mikoyan that corresponded, by the way, with the archival material in Moscow. So that was, I think, really quite interesting. But I also see, again, we're talking about maybe doing a deeper social history of this. I see my book more as a starting point in this regard, especially when we talk about his visits to the regions, his contributions to the regions, because there's so much material there. When you see the crowds in Kirovakan, when you see the crowds in Sanain, in places like this, you know that there's a story there. Some people had to remember that. It was just too big.
Do you think that history is simply overshadowed by the history of his participation in the purges?
I think part of it may be, but the history of the purges was not really even that studied that well in Armenia. That would almost be giving Mark too much credit to the advancement of the study of the history of the purges in Armenia, in post-Soviet Armenia today. Post-Soviet Armenia, we have a lot of focus on memory studies on the Stalinist repressions, but we don't have a lot of good political history on the Stalinist repressions. Like nobody knew about this central intervention by Malenkov I mean, people knew about it anecdotally, but you don't realize how centralized it was. Like I worked, by the way, not only with archival materials from Irgaspi and Garf and Ergani and places like this, but also I worked with Memorial. And so I even used archival materials that were from the FSB archives that were Xeroxed in 1992. So I was able to put together a whole picture of the history of the repressions in Armenia that even people in Armenia didn't know the details about. Like when you go work in the Yerevan archives, you actually see that we don't have any kind of stenogram, we don't have any transcript of the plenum of September 1937. And you also have to think, Mark, this. When I talked about that, the 1937 intervention, you have to think the NKVD brigade was running the internal affairs commissariat of Armenia from September 14th, 1937 to October 20th, 1937. And people who are arrested in that period of time, their files are not in Yerevan. They're in the Repressed Persons Fund, which is 1191 in Yerevan. But those files are in Moscow. So, for instance, Amatuni, who was repressed in 1937, his file of arrest, his original file, is in Moscow, but the file dealing with his rehabilitation is in Yerevan. So, so, my point is that there's so much that even on the repressions is really understudied. But in terms of this whole history about Mikoyan, part of it I think is due to Mikoyan himself, because Mikoyan did not want to advertise his role in Armenian affairs. He didn't want to be known as the Armenian lobbyist because he was very sensitive to how other republics might, interpret that. So one time, for example, Asatryan recounts in his memoirs how the Soviet Armenian government was in desperate need of cement, and Uzbekistan had a surplus of cement, and they needed this surplus. Uzbekistan basically told Yerevan, Tashkent told Yerevan, we're ready to give you the cement. But what you have to do, but basically what Yerevan needed to get the cement was they needed the signature of Kosygin. And Kosygin was on vacation in Sochi, and they couldn't get to him. So they tried going to Mikoyan to ask for his signature. And Mikoyan said, I'm not going to sign this, because if I sign this, the Uzbeks will say that the Armenian Mikoyan took the cement from Uzbekistan and gave it to Armenia. And it will look like I'm doing favoritism here, And Mikoyan, he was a patriot, but he also was a committed socialist, and he was a committed, internationalist in the final result, in the final picture. But overall, he didn't want to be seen as being like a lobbyist for Armenia. But the evidence overwhelmingly, shows that this was the case, that he was kind of a sort of a lobbyist for Armenia. But this also, you have to understand, this is in the competition with other republics to gain resources from Moscow. And even when we look at Azerbaijan, they had a lobbyist there. When you look at the Politburo with Haydar Aliyev in the Brezhnev period, they had their own lobbyists there. That's not even counting Stalin and the influence that Georgia had in the Soviet Union when you look at, kind of the Stalin period. So, and even beyond the Stalin period, really. Even when we look at Shevardnadze, who was later on the foreign minister from the first secretary of Georgia. So it goes on like this. But that was, I think, his main concern. And I think that in the end, that affected the impression of him. And I also think that there is an element of maybe certain hardliners in the Kremlin, possibly even starting a whisper campaign that might have infiltrated Armenia, where they didn't like Mikoyan because he was close to Khrushchev, and he was seen as a reformer, a liberal, quote unquote, in the Soviet leadership. And the hardliners like Suslov and others didn't like this. And it's very feasible that, maybe they started some kind of whisper campaign to kind of, discredit Mikoyan in Soviet Armenia. That's also a possibility.
Can we come back to the question of the reforms that he was involved in trying to implement? First of all, there's a question here. What were Mikoyan's views on the economy, Soviet economy, when he and Khrushchev were seeking these democratic reforms? And maybe a larger question, what ultimately was the outcome of these efforts to implement these reforms?
Well, the outcome of the efforts was, as I mentioned in my presentation, that they were never realized because Khrushchev was overthrown by Brezhnev and company. Brezhnev and company kept up. Mikoyan, by the way, was against the overthrow of Khrushchev. He was supporting Khrushchev till the end, but Khrushchev was overthrown, and Mikoyan was kept on by Brezhnev and company as like a figurehead, because that was his position. He was the the president of the Soviet Union. He was the really the chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, right? There's a good quote in my book from Anton Khrushchev where basically he says that finally, this is when Mikoyan was appointed, that finally an Armenian has ascended to the Russian throne, right? Because this is a famous moment where people also know that he was president of the Soviet Union in some capacity for a limited time. But under Brezhnev, they kept him on for like a year, and then Mikoyan got tired of them, understandably so, because he couldn't do anything. He wasn't able to do any reforms or anything like this. So he himself resigned, and he said, I had enough of this crew. I just couldn't deal with them anymore. They were too, I guess you could say, too kind of, stuck in the mud for me, right? But in terms of, the economy, Khrushchev and Mikoyan, and in particular Mikoyan, they both felt that the economy, the Soviet state was way too centralized, way too centralized. And the idea was to devolve more powers to the republics. Khrushchev had an experiment known as the Sovnarkhoz reform, where the idea was to devolve economic planning and economic powers to the Union republics, really, and also to kind of sub-districts within larger republics like Ukraine or Kazakhstan. But this reform met with resistance from the bureaucrats, so it was never fully realized. Now, the best person to speak about that issue would be my colleague Natalia Kibita of Ukraine, because she speaks about this reform in its relationship with Ukraine. She knows all about, she could tell you all about the Sovnarkhozy and all this. Although that also comes up in my book too, my research on Mikoyan in Armenia. But another way that the economy was actually quite important was Mikoyan and Khrushchev saw the kind of the flourishing and the success of national republics like Armenia. And Armenia would have been seen by Mikoyan as a textbook example of this. And this is one of the reasons why he helps. It's not just that he's a patriot for Armenia, it's also that he wants to highlight Armenia as a model of Soviet success. And that has immense possibilities, you have to think, because as somebody who knows international affairs, Mikoyan, he also knows that it's incredibly good in terms of soft power to highlight this example to the Armenian diaspora to show, look how prosperous Soviet Armenia is, look at the economy is running very good and all this and that. And so the development of national republics was seen as a kind of an indicator of so-called success in the Soviet system and development, really. But they also believed that the development could be, the development could be improved even more if more powers are devolved to the Union republics. If Union republics actually have more of a say, if there's a real socialist democracy in the Soviet Union, they use this term socialist democracy, and more powers would be devolved not only to maybe national republics, but also to workers. Actually, the idea would be kind of going along the lines of maybe worker self-management. And that's what's so remarkable to me about reading all this. And by the way, what happened later on, we talk about Brezhnev, is in the 70s, there's the famous, Brezhnev Constitution, or infamous Brezhnev Constitution, which was so funny because it's the same constitution, draft constitution, that was from the Khrushchev period, from 1964, because they got, Mark, they have to think, they got as far as drafting the constitution. So we have a draft constitution from 1964. But all the radical democratic elements in the Brezhnev version are mysteriously gone. They're not there. So in the Brezhnev version in the 1970s, it's kind of like a watered down version of what actually would have been, the case, what actually would have been a real consequential reform for the Soviet Union. It could have changed not only Soviet history, like I said, but even world history. Right?
How widely were these efforts at reform known in real time, if at all?
They were known somewhat because what happened was the Soviet government, like I said, they solicited the public's input on these reforms. So there was a major effort to kind of get people to write letters providing suggestions for how we should reform nationality policy. In some cases, these reforms were taken into account, or these proposals, ideas were taken into account from the people, from average citizens, Mark, like you and me. Not like, I'm not talking about like that they sought, input of, I don't know, Kosygin or whatever, although he was running one of the committees. But the idea was that they asked the average man on the street what they thought of the reforms, what could be done. Like it goes back to the great question in the Russian history, going to Chernyshevsky or to Lenin, the idea of what is to be done, And so the idea was effectively that the people would be writing these letters to Mikoyan and Khrushchev, And they would be saying things like, you know what, maybe we should remove the nationality column from the Soviet passports, or maybe Nagorno-Karabakh should be unified with Soviet Armenia. And by the way, maybe there should be a special clause in the Soviet constitution that the Russian SFSR should not secede, which turned out to be very consequential because in 1991, the republic that ultimately was the catalyst for the breakup of the USSR was Russia itself, led by Mr. Yeltsin. Okay, it's really quite interesting, and not only that, there were even proposals to unify North and South Ossetia and all this. And that Mikoyan found this quite interesting. But the one interesting thing is that some of these proposals, some of these ideas, were actually taken into account. So Mikoyan actually, there was one letter writer who suggested that all autonomous oblasts should be transferred to the rank of autonomous republics. Now imagine what would happen. And suddenly Artsakh would become an autonomous republic. And if Artsakh was given the right as an autonomous republic to change the jurisdiction, the Union Republic to which it's subordinated, imagine what would have happened. It would have been a completely different history. Maybe the Artsakh issue would have resolved itself more peacefully than what we ended up having if these reforms were realized. So that's why I'm saying it's a great kind of like, alternative history, kind of like, what if kind of scenario. But it's also the big question I have, which I've not been able to answer yet, is what was the influence of this? Because this is all deeply documented material in the archives about the reform. What was the impact of these reforms, let's say, on Gorbachev's reforms? When Gorbachev was working to democratize the Soviet system in the late 80s, early 90s, did he know about this? Was he going back in the archives and looking this up? We don't know. I don't really know. But it's amazing how evocative, how much that history of Gorbachev and the New Union Treaty and his efforts to really kind of democratize, the whole Soviet system, how it's amazing how that so strongly echoes what Khrushchev and Mikoyan were trying to do in 1964. That's the other interesting thing about all this.
Can you talk about Mikoyan's role in Soviet foreign policy?
Yes, I can a little bit. This wasn't the main thing I focused on the book, but Mikoyan's role in the Soviet foreign policy, he became kind of like, he was not the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, but he was seen as somebody who had exceptionally good skills in terms of soft power, especially in relation to a country like the United States. So in 1959, he came to America. He came to New York. He was in Washington. He also came to my hometown, Cleveland, Ohio. Giving a shout out to Cleveland right there. He also went to Detroit. So when I was living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, there was a tailor in the town named Vahan. Right, as soon as I saw the sign Vahan, I thought, oh my God, this is an Armenian guy. I have to go meet him. So I went to go meet him, and he told me that way back in 1959, Mikoyan came to Detroit, and he was there as a young man, and he spoke to Mikoyan in Armenian. And Mikoyan responded back to him, and they spoke very similar to the famous episode recounted by the former U.S. ambassador Edward Jerry Jean, right, where he meets Mikoyan. He's working in the office of Dean Rusk, and he meets Mikoyan one day in Washington. And anyway, but the point is that Mikoyan was somebody who knew the value of the soft power, right, and not only in terms of the United States, but also in relations with Cuba, right. This was one of the main things he used to kind of persuade Castro to kind of remove the missiles from Cuba, because that was the second Cuban Missile Crisis. So we know the main Cuban Missile Crisis between Kennedy and Khrushchev, to kind of dial down the tensions, the big deal that they struck. You remove your missiles from Turkey and you remove your missiles from Cuba, and then we'll kind of call it a day. But the big problem was Fidel felt like he had been played like a pawn on the superpower chessboard, and it was up to Mikoyan to persuade Fidel to bring those weapons back, right? It wasn't easy. And as we know, actually, even his wife died. Mikoyan had to stay in Cuba, and he had to do his diplomatic work, and his wife died in the meantime. And he had to send his son Sergo to go there and to attend the funeral. And Sergo also, I want to mention too, when we talk about Karabakh, was a big advocate for the Karabakh movement, even to the point that, I'm telling you, you probably know this too, because again, as I was mentioning, you're up there in Belmont, right? You're in Metro Boston effectively, and so it was in 1987, 86, something like this, that Sergo he was in Boston, and he went to the headquarters of the Mirror Spectator. And they interviewed him about Karabakh, right? And he was like saying, "Oh, I think it's going to be unified any day now." And unfortunately, he was incorrect on that, projection. But nevertheless, he was one of the major advocates for that. But anyway, going back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, Mikoyan had a very good way of working with people, even when it was difficult to negotiate. So I mentioned the famous episode with Che Guevara, that he tried to negotiate with Che Guevara, Soviet trade deals, right? This was also another one of Mikoyan's, elements, trade. When we talk about, let's say, food, and let's say pakbahak, for the kiddos, or I don't know, beef steaks, this kind of a thing. He even advised Aram Piruzyan, the food minister of Soviet Armenia, to do a cookbook, Armenian Cooking, which is kind of like the Armenian edition of the book of tasty and healthy food, which was Mikoyan's another of his achievements in the food industry. But in terms of Che Guevara, he was talking with him, and he couldn't get anything out of Che. He couldn't agree with him on anything. It was like this kind of very tough negotiation. And Mikoyan finally said, "You know what? I know exactly why they call you Che, because Che means no in Armenian, and that's why we can't come to an agreement." And Che, when he heard this, roared with laughter. He thought it was the funniest thing. But that was Mikoyan. He was somebody who was able to he was able to project the soft power very effectively. And people in the United States actually liked him, especially at a time when nobody was, the Americans really, even though Khrushchev, as we know, especially now in retrospect, had the instincts of a reformer, Americans they would turn on the TV and they would see this, angry man at the UN slamming his shoe at the podium saying, "We will bury you," or at least this was the impression, right? There was also some question. Maybe it was mistranslated, I think, in the end of the day, right? Like so much else. Like Ahmadinejad, whatever. The bottom line is that, nevertheless, that Mikoyan was seen in that context as somebody the Americans could talk to, somebody who was smooth, who really was, a good kind of diplomat, a consummate diplomat, and like they would call him, Mr. K's fix-it man. Right. There was somebody who could meet with, he at once could meet with Ike, and then he could also meet with Sophia Loren and Jerry Lewis in Hollywood. And that was how Mikoyan was. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah, there are other questions. As anyone who is watching can figure out, Pietro is very knowledgeable and enthusiastic on the subject, and it comes through in the book as well. So I do encourage you to check out the book. And we'll have a couple more questions before we wrap up. How was Mikoyan depicted or covered? Of course, we're talking about across many years in the Armenian press, or
Well,
let's say diasporan press more generally.
It's divided. It's absolutely divided. And this is something you helped me with, Mark, because you helped me dig up wonderful newspapers from 1950s, from Hajrednik Weekly, where the Dajnaks were going at Mikoyan really, really hard. And they were saying he's a traitor to the nation and all this and that. Now, Mikoyan, in his own right, was very hard on the Dajnaks. And what was interesting to me, actually, though, was that sometimes he would get like overboard in his criticism of Dajnaks, but then he would like cross out that maybe he thought maybe this is excessively harsh against my, kind of political opponents. So there was kind of some, like respect there, even if he disagreed with them, some kind of like gentleman's agreement, so that kind of a thing. I knew he knew when to pull back. But Armenians who would be like more affiliated, let's say maybe were like Hunchaks or Ramkavars, they would be more sympathetic to Mikoyan. They would see him as an Armenian success on the international stage, and so there was a split. Again, it was really similar to the split along the lines of whether or not you accepted Soviet Armenia or you did not accept Soviet Armenia. And so it was just like that whole kind of like, Cold War division within the Armenian community. It fell along those lines. So if you were an Armenian who was, more sympathetic to the Soviet Armenia, and you thought, well, Soviet Armenia is the Armenia, and we should acknowledge that reality, and we should, work with the people there, you would have one impression of Mikoyan. But then if you were somebody who was Dajnak, hardcore Dajnak, you would say, oh, Mikoyan is awful. And it's not only Mikoyan, by the way. They would say all the Armenian Bolsheviks are terrible and da-da-da, and they betrayed the nation to Moscow and whatever, and, so on and so forth. But again, what's interesting is this dialogue Mikoyan has in his work about these national issues, and it's also quite interesting too when you look at a case like Antranik, because Antranik is somebody who, again, as we know, split from the Dajnaks. But Mikoyan, served in his under. I mean, he was part of Antranik's volunteer battalion, serving in northern Iran. Actually, back in the day. And later on, Mikoyan participated in this effort by the Soviet Armenian government to rehabilitate Antranik. Not only Mikoyan, by the way, Marshal Bagramian, that, and this again was very controversial in the Soviet context because there were many voices in Azerbaijan who did not like Antranik. So there was some controversy over this matter, by the way. But Mikoyan was involved in that element as well. And also, there was some other interesting information I found in the archives, like Ashot Hovhannisyan, who was the first secretary of Armenia in the 20s and later a very prominent Soviet Armenian historian. He actually was given a manuscript on the history of Nagorno-Karabakh in the period of, I want to say, 1917 to 1920. And he gave a copy of it in Armenian to Mikoyan. And the most interesting thing was the afterword of this, which was effectively in Armenian. It was the Armenian translation of the appeal to Khrushchev by the Karabakh Armenians in 1962, right? And he even wrote, Ashot Hovhannisyan wrote to Mikoyan that he met with Mikoyan in Moscow and told him about this manuscript. But he even said that this part, about the letter to Khrushchev, is the most interesting part. It's the most fascinating part. And so, and that whole manuscript, by the way, with a map of Nagorno-Karabakh, the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, that whole manuscript is in Mikoyan's files in Ergaspi in Moscow. So that was also quite interesting to me. And that's another kind of side point to drive home. But again, even the notes for his 54 speech, there's a lot of focus on the genocide, Russian-Armenian relations, the legacy of the Armenian Revolutionary Movement, and that actually was the foundation for his discussions in the spoken speech on Rafi and Pakanyan, as a matter of fact.
Mikoyan lived till 1978, I think.
Yes.
What did he do in his later years?
In his later years, he was mostly focused on writing his memoirs, which were actually published first in parts, not necessarily. I mean, because there was it was published as in book form in the Soviet era. There were 2 volumes that were actually quite censored. They were heavily edited by Soviet censors, according to his son Sergo. But actually, in the journal Unist, so the youth journal, elements of Mikoyan's memoirs were published throughout the late 1960s. And finally, in the early 70s, these 2 volumes were published of his memoirs, and first in Russian and then in Armenian. And that actually, Mark, is a quite interesting story because, again, I barely touched on this, but the Soviet Armenian historians in this period of time were seeking Mikoyan's advice on Armenian national issues. And there was a whole interesting discussion that I cover in my book, which deals with his meeting with Soviet Armenian historians in 1962. And it provides Mikoyan's very frank opinions on various issues, including the Bolshevik-Kemalist collaboration, on Stalinism, on, I don't know, the Western Armenian volunteer movement. He even says this is a national liberation movement for Western Armenia, and so on and so forth. But what's interesting about that is that he felt that because they were constantly consulting him as a living source, as it were, on the history of the Caucasian revolutionary movement, that he felt if I published my memoirs, that would clarify a lot of things, and I won't have to be constantly advising these guys about this. So that's what he did, actually. One of his major tasks after he retired was to kind of just do that. Plus, also, he did keep his supreme Soviet position for Armenia for quite a few years, even after he retired from high office. And actually, it wasn't until 1974 that Brezhnev and company forced him to give up that supreme Soviet seat. So he was still advising Soviet Armenia all the way up until the early 70s, actually. And even Soviet Armenian officials, again, are recounting this, that he would go and we would still seek out his opinion, or we would ask him things and stuff like this. And that was going on all the way till the early 70s. And then finally, by the time he's, even in the 70s, the other thing he also is very active in doing is promoting the memory of his old revolutionary comrade and mentor, Stepan Shamian. So constantly writing like dedications to Shamian in Pravda, let's say, even right up to the point of his death. Actually, Mikoyan would do things like this. So, or even like advising, if you look at kind of like the bulletin of the Armenian archives, we have many back copies of that, not only in Yerevan, but also they're digitized online. You can access them online. He actually, as a matter of fact, would advise Armenian historians on some of these issues related to the Armenian Bolshevik movement, related to Stepan Shamian and whatnot. And that's also something he would do in his later years. So he was heavily involved in all these projects. That's not even counting de-Stalinization. I was, mentioning about the legacies of that he kept on trying to also keep this legacy, this memory alive of, the need to preserve, the memory of those who died as a result of the cult of personality, as he would call it. So actually, he was actually also quite influential in trying to kind of even keep up the discussion on Stalinism, which in that time, by the way, and we're talking about Brezhnev's period of time, that became very controversial because, there was almost like an effort to kind of pull that back under Brezhnev to some extent. Mikoyan was one of these people who felt that we should be discussing this. And again, it kind of goes to show you that when you look at the Soviet history, whether it's Khrushchev or Gorbachev, that whenever you have these free discussions on Stalin and de-Stalinization, it's often associated in the Soviet and Russian context with democratization. So that was considered actually from some of the perspective of some of these more kind of Brezhnevian types or more kind of bureaucratic types to be quite dangerous, to kind of go into that direction. But this was Mikoyan effectively.
So to conclude, you alluded near the beginning to the groundbreaking work of Mary Kilbourne Matosian some 60 years ago
Yeah.
plus. Obviously, this points to a shortage of scholarship in English on the Soviet Armenian period. What are some of your future projects on less studied aspects of Soviet Armenian history? Several people, including
I'm
me,
really,
asked.
if you don't mind me saying this, I'm really excited to get into studying the period of the new economic policy, that is to say, the 1920s. And so I'm really interested in studying the biography of Myasny Khan, because Myasny Khan is considered like a major hero figure in Armenia, not that well known much at all in the diaspora, but especially nowadays when we have so many young people in Armenia, especially because now, if I may say so, and this might be controversial to say in some quarters, but Armenia right now is kind of like in a leadership crisis, right? It's no secret. But Myasny Khan would be a good role model for many young Armenians. So it's important for not only, but it's not just a matter of looking at him as like a role model, but also to like assess him critically, to like do a good critical study of Myasny Khan, and also to kind of do it like in English. So I'm interested in the figure of Myasny Khan, but also I'm interested in kind of like a social history of Armenia under the new economic policy in the 20s. I'm interested also in focusing on the role of Lukashin, who was another very, very obscure Soviet Armenian leader who did a lot for Armenia in the 20s in terms of rebuilding the republic. We're talking, Mark, this is the same period where Tamanyan is realizing his city plan for Yerevan, which becomes kind of the emblem of the period, where you also have these great writers like Chadens, Imbakuns, also Shushani Kurginian, many of these other, luminaries, even Martir Rostaryan is coming back to Armenia at this point, that this is a cultural revival going on in the 20s before the Stalinist period. And not only that, you also have the cinema is being born in Armenia with Beknazarian and Namus and I don't know, many other motion pictures like Zade and many, many others. And so for me personally, that would be the next step. And here in Yerevan, we have very accessible and very rich archives that can help me, dive really deep into that subject because it's really quite interesting. Myasny Khan, by the way, another interesting thing about him was that he was a major advocate for the unification of Nagorno-Karabakh with Armenia, going back to this period of like the early 20s. And he was the one who spearheaded this idea that, to help kind of quell the rebellion in Zengezur, because as we know, Nezhde had his Republic of Mountainous Armenia in Zengezur, that the idea is to kind of incentivize them to stop revolting. We'll give Karabakh to Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia, right? I always stress to say Nagorno-Karabakh because again, it's not the whole Karabakh. I mean, it's not like the lowland Karabakh too. The main thing is Nagorno-Karabakh or Mountainous Karabakh Artsakh, as we know it. And basically, Myasny Khan was very big on advocating for this. But as we know, the famous vote or infamous vote in the 1920s in the Politburo in 1921, July 1921, where that decision was reversed thanks to the pressure of our good friend Narimanov, and also some might also like Olga Shatanovskaya has alleged in her memoirs that Narimanov was supported by Stalin, as a matter of fact. Although again, we need more evidence, to kind of dig into this. But this is also something else that has been kind of mentioned. But in the first Congress of the Armenian Communist Party, January 1922, it was Myasny Khan who said that Azerbaijan threatened to halt kerosene supplies to Armenia if they didn't give up their claims to Mountainous Karabakh. So this is another interesting element of this historical figure, but I hope to explore him actually as well. That would be my next step. And to explore him, like I say, critically, to do a good scientific examination, just like I did here with Mikoyan, but to do that with Myasny Khan and kind of go deep into all the materials that I can find and so on and so forth.
That'd be great. It's good to move beyond simple heroes and villains,
Absolutely, yes.
because at least with Mikoyan and as with so many other important figures, there's a tendency to see it as either he was an Armenian hero or he was an Armenian traitor with nothing, with no gradation in between those two possibilities. So
Yes. Absolutely.
I encourage everyone to check the book out. Again, it's really valuable and interesting work. So thank you for doing it, Pietro. And
Thank you very much, Mark, for having me. And also, I also have to say this, Mark. Thank you for and thank my thanks to you and to NAASR for all the support you've given my project, and also for the assistance you've lent me. When I was up in whether I was in Yerevan or St. Petersburg, and I would be writing to you, asking questions all the way to Belmont, Massachusetts. Inquiries about whether you could scan something for me. Can you double check this? I might not have access to this here or something like that. And you guys were always on hand to do that. And I have to say bravo, because it was a huge help to me on many different things. And especially, like I say, with those Hibernic, scans that you gave me. And not only that, also Mirror Spectator, so many other, pieces of historical evidence. So, bravo to NAASR.
thank you.
And thank you so much.
This is what we do. This is what we love to do. Get people information to do their work. It's
Yes,
really what it's
absolutely.
all about.
Yeah.
So again, thank you. Thank you everybody who's with us today or is watching this in the future. Thank you to the Gulbenkian Foundation for supporting these programs, and thank you to the Society for Armenian Studies for co-sponsoring today. We'll see you up the road, Pietro. Keep in touch, and everybody else, stay well.
All right. Thank you. Hajo.
Okay.
How do you think? How do you think that was?
I think it was very good, but we're still live, so I'm going to say fairly well.